you have to be extremely careful, not in what you charge, but how you present the options to the customer and how the customer can be guided through them.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
I mean, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the intricate relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and today we're going to kick off a brand new season of Impact Pricing. What? You're only 6 seasons in or 6 episodes in. What's a season? Well, the first 6 episodes were me talking to pricing people about pricing. There really wasn't a theme. The next several episodes, we're going to focus on subscription pricing. This is the season of subscriptions. And kicking us off today, our guest is Jim Geisman. And here are 3 things you really want to know about Jim before we start. He founded a company called Software Pricing Partners over 35 years ago. Wow. He's been pricing longer than some of you have been alive. He has an incredible understanding of not only pricing, but also software. That's what's going to make this fascinating. And by the way, the reason that he's so smart is he got his MBA from Harvard. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to hire you for my eulogy, but you'll have to get your money from my estate. Yeah, that was a great intro. Thank you very much.
No worries.
Anyhow, okay.
We've talked many times over the years, and I always find our conversations fascinating. And so here we are recording one so other people can listen in, and this will be great. But I got to start with Harvard. I was kind of making fun a little bit. How did you justify the decision to go full-time and spend all that money for a Harvard MBA?
Well, first of all, it was a long time ago, so the tuition wasn't as bad. I had a working life. I had worked for 8 years, and it was just time for an intellectual whack on the side of the head. I was just very fortunate in getting in. I got a get in now, but I had, I had a couple of incredible recommendations. So I think that plus my age got me in. It wasn't my brilliance.
No.
I don't think so. And by the way, I founded Software Pricing Partners, I think, it was probably in the 90s, but I've been consulting for more than 35 years, so that part is correct. And I've been doing pricing since the late 80s, early 90s as well.
Oh, don't confess to your age there. You look like a young guy.
Yeah, well, thanks, but you put me on the spot. Okay, enough of this stuff.
Yeah, so the easy, let's give you the softball first. How did you get into pricing? Why do you find pricing so fun?
Well, first of all, I got into pricing because, frankly, I was looking for a way to differentiate myself. And along the line, I was talking to a friend of mine who was one of the founding teams of Mentor Graphics, and asked them what kept them up at night, and it turned out there was something called a license server that was coming on stream, and I did a syndicated study of the impact of license servers on business models, and from that, it was very easy to see that the reason business models were upset by license servers were you no longer paid per seat, but rather paid per access to it through the software. And the access could float in a network. So people, were very concerned about that shift. And pricing is one of those things where I say you're really balancing the interests of sales, marketing, biz dev, finance, operations, and development. So you have to have an understanding of how all the pieces knit together. And there aren't a lot of people that do that well, or at all. A lot of people go narrow and deep. I went wide and less deep, obviously, except in the pricing area. So that's really how I got started.
Yeah, and I find your comment about being really broad absolutely accurate, because what so often happens is people think that pricing is, we have to put this number on this product. But
absolutely,
it is every single department in the company has influence and is involved in this. It's just incredible.
Yes, that's right. In fact, the way I've approached pricing over the years is the last thing you do is you put a price on something, because if you don't tell somebody what they're getting, which is the packaging, and how their payments are going to scale, which has to do with the metric, the price you get, you're going to pay when you hit volume, which has to do with discount. You can't set a number. So you have to go through the whole thing, figuring out what the metric is, how you're going to package up the features, and then finally put a price tag that reflects the value you're delivering even over volume.
And so when we think about subscription pricing, the single biggest question is, what do you charge for? Right? What's the pricing metric? What's the pricing model? Do you have any generic thoughts on that we could share with people?
Sure. First of all, the metric that makes the most sense is the one that makes the most sense to the customer. And the customer, and when I say customer, I'm talking about the economic buyer who approves the purchase and writes the check. They may have a different way of reckoning value than you think or you may want. For example, many customers in the financial services business reckon assets under management. I mean, that's sort of their mark of success. The more assets under management, they are perceived as being more important in that industry. And therefore, if you're charging a financial services firm for something that has to do with their portfolios, and you're charging on the basis of number of users, a financial service purchaser of your software, while they might say, oh, this is a great deal, it's a great deal because the vendor is not making out. On the other hand, a lot of the financial service people say, but I've got thousands of users, but they don't use it very often. And you get all sorts of pushback like that, and you're just better off saying, look, we charge as a percent of assets under management, and that's the end of it. Now, one of the problems there is those assets under management must be disclosed. So if you're serving a vertical industry, take a look at how you create value and then make sure the metric aligns with that value. Now, if you're more horizontal, you may, there are a couple of things that are possible. Number one, number of users, or something like that, might be the way to go. On the other hand, let's take an accounting package that's used in a manufacturing firm and used in a hospital. You could charge for users in both cases, but you might be better off saying, okay, I'm going to charge hospitals based on the number of beds, patient encounters, whatever that may be. And on the manufacturing side, I may charge according to manufacturing throughput, number of SKUs, or users. But the point is, if you have multiple metrics, you've got to be able to relate those multiple metrics back to one metric so you can measure relative financial performance in these other segments you may serve.
Okay, Jim, I got to stop you because there was so much brilliance in what you just said. I've been studying this topic for quite a while. You defined a pricing metric as the pricing metric that makes sense is the one that makes sense to the buyer. And I kind of snickered inside. It's like, yeah, really, really, really. And then you start to think about it, and that is an incredible definition. Well, because I often say the pricing metric we're after is the one that's as closely aligned to value as we could get, to how the buyer perceives value.
I think that I don't see an inconsistency.
Well, so what I love about your definition, by the way, I'm going to use both now in the future. What I love about your definition is it's very possible that there's something that's really highly correlated with value that doesn't make sense in the buyer's mind. And so the buyer says, no, I'm not going to pay for that. I'm only going to pay for it this way. So imagine Salesforce, right? Salesforce should be charging based on the amount of revenue that you're bringing in through Salesforce.
Well, you could argue that, except Salesforce doesn't bring in revenue. It's the people that use Salesforce that bring in revenue.
But who gets the most value from it?
The sales guy gets the most value for it. And indeed, salesman's value is related to the revenue that he generates, which is supported by Salesforce. So Salesforce has an indirect connection to revenue. I mean, if for example, you had thousands of users of Salesforce, but none of them were salespeople, there's no revenue and no reason to buy Salesforce. On the other hand, Salesforce in the hands of an effective salesperson will generate far more value than an ineffective salesperson. So that begins to tell you that it's really the sales rep or the support behavior that is generating the value. When I say support behavior, because I've thought about this a bit, there were other alternatives. I think, back in the early days when Salesforce, came on the scene, it certainly made sense. I mean, look, this is for salespeople, so we're going to charge by the number of salespeople, which we're going to shorthand by saying number of seats. But then as you have sales support people using Salesforce, the number of seats, should be in support of the sales effort, but sometimes they aren't. Now, Salesforce could have charged for the amount of money in the contracts in flight, the value of the proposals, the number of prospects. There were a number of metrics, but I think I certainly agree with it given the point in time when Salesforce came on the scene. I think number of salespeople, number of users. That's obvious, that's easy, and it's close enough to the truth so that, who's going to push back on that? But wait a minute, I don't want to pay for another copy of Salesforce. Well, okay, so you don't want to support the salesperson to make their numbers?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I get it.
Let me do this one more time, Jim. By the way, you and I are in complete agreement.
Sure.
But the way I'm looking at this is I've got one company that has a $300K quota per salesperson.
Yep.
And I have another company that's got a $3 million quota per salesperson.
Yep.
I got to tell you, the one with the $3 million quota is getting more value out of making their salespeople more effective.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was saying, I think if you tied it to revenue, you're closer to the value. But as you so eloquently described, people don't perceive it that way. It's easier for me as a buyer to say, oh, I'll pay for the seats instead of saying I'm going to pay you a percentage of my revenue.
Yeah, and I think percentage of revenue is a tricky one anyhow, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But I think you point out something that's really important for everybody to recognize, because if your users can, you have two salespeople and one is more effective, the other is less effective. Number one, you really can't charge more for the more effective person unless you know that person is indeed more effective, and you don't necessarily know the quota. And even if you wanted to know the quota, people might not give you the quota, and the quota changes. And I mean, and you go down a rabbit hole.
Yep.
And I think when you're choosing a metric, it is a compromise. I mean, you want to get as close to value as you can, but value that's recognized by the customer, and one that doesn't take a lot of education and going down rat holes and dealing with corner cases. And often what happens is, as you probably want to know, you spin your wheels for a while. You say, well, this is really best, but Salesforce can't cope with it. The customer is a little goosey about it, so you make a compromise and you do whatever's effective. Now, I was going to say something about the percent of revenue. You can do that if you are directly in line with the revenue. Your Visa card example in the beginning, 2.5 points for the transaction. Well, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I'm facilitating a financial transaction that has value to you, and I'm going to take a piece of that value. Oh, I get it. While you can argue about the percentage, you can't argue about the principle. And I think that's really what you're going after when you try to find the, quote, right metric, which, as I say, is often a compromise because you're serving multiple segments, or you're serving multiple customers within a vertical that have different perceptions of that.
Yes. I think this revenue thing, we want to be close to it, but I think it's really hard to be on it. But we have to be really in the line of the revenue to make it make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so a realtor's pulling in 6% of the sale. They're in the line of the revenue.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Let's so we started the conversation off with talking about usage, and let's bring it back to usage for a second, because it feels to me like that's the holy grail where people are trying to get to, because it's often really closely tied to value. Any thoughts on that?
I agree with you, but I think it's often hard to monetize that. First of all, one of the arguments that always played software vendors, and it really doesn't matter whether they were SaaS or on-premise, perpetual or subscription, is if you charge for user or usage, there's heavy usage, heavy users, light users. Your light user might be my heavy user, and my heavy user might be your super user. And you don't want to go down there. I think, what you want to do is, you want to talk about usage or consumption, but I think it's really the usage of the value that you're creating with your software. I mean, we're mincing words here, but the issue is your software creates value for the customer, which is the reason they buy it.
Mm-hmm.
And you want them to pay you fairly for that value. And fairly may be a compromise across all your customers or within a particular customer. And usage, there may be a surrogate for usage that you have to use. But sorry about that background noise.
That's okay. Do you want me to get it?
No, I think it's actually for you.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So another piece of brilliant. By the way, we're almost out of time, and I'm only halfway through the topics I wanted to talk about.
Oh, okay.
But we're going to quit here just a second. The other piece of brilliance that you gave earlier, you had mentioned that when we're in vertical markets, we could be closer to value.
Yeah.
And when we're in horizontal markets, we choose something else that's probably seats or cores or something else like that. I think that ties right back to this usage conversation, in that usage is much easier to do when we're in a vertical market.
I think I would modify a little bit of what you said about being in a horizontal market. Namely, I would never use a hardware metric. You mentioned cores. So that I banished hardware metrics from my line of thinking, because the hardware that a customer chooses to run your software on is their decision. And the only thing you have to worry about is that they don't buy underpowered hardware so that they're going to performance on it. So, but other than that, you're right. The metric, if you're serving multiple segments, the metric will probably be a combination if you want to use a single metric across all the segments you serve, or you have to figure out a way to normalize the multiple metrics that you may be running. And if you were clever about doing that, you could avoid the nightmare that Oracle has. And if you take a look at their price book, they charge according to number of plants, number of seats, terabytes, hospital beds. I mean, come on.
Right. It takes a genius to figure out what to price.
Exactly. And by the way, AWS, a wonderful subscription service, is the same thing. And I think when you have a highly technical product that has to be specifically configured for the customer, you have to be extremely careful, not in what you charge, but how you present the options to the customer and how the customer can be guided through them.
Yep. One of my favorite lines, confused buyers don't buy.
That's exactly right. Well, they may not buy, but they'll certainly delay their buy, and you will probably lose that opportunity to someone else who has figured out a simpler way of presenting their product.
All right, Jim, so I have to tell you that I really wanted to talk about pricing metrics, which we just did for 20 some minutes.
Okay.
And I wanted to get into packaging and how that ties to pricing, which is probably just as big a topic. But we're going to have to do this again sometime. Hopefully you'll come back.
Well, I'd be happy to. And I'd love to talk about discounting, which is what took us on this road. And it's particularly problematic for subscription prices.
Nice. And I do want to ask one last question. This is the impact question.
Sure.
What's the one thing most of our listeners could do to have a big impact?
Other than being competent? You mean having
I was thinking
more specific.
I was thinking a piece of pricing advice.
Oh, like pricing advice. Yeah.
Choose a good value. I don't want to give you the answers.
No. Well, I think. Well, I think there are a couple of things they can do. Number one, what they can do is take a look at the way they make their purchase decisions and incorporate some of their own personal buyer skepticism and objections into how they do pricing for their company. Because what I found is an awful lot of people will do dumb things in B2B, especially, and sometimes in B2C, because they've forgotten what they do as regular consumers. They've forgotten how they evaluate prices. How do they evaluate deals? So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is I found an awful lot of people have all the answers to pricing. Unfortunately, they ask the wrong questions, the answers to the wrong questions. And I think, it is good to get a grounding in pricing. And sometimes it's great if you have a mentor or a coach to help you through this, somebody you can use as a sounding board. Hiring consultants is good, especially in politically hot situations, because you can hold them up and let them take the flak.
Mm-hmm.
But, experience counts here. If you don't know, if you're a senior executive in a software company, don't delegate this to the most junior person or even a person who might be a great product manager, but doesn't know very much about pricing. Because this is a career limiting function. I mean, if you do it right, it's thankless, and if you do it wrong, you're fired.
Yeah, so I certainly agree with the do it wrong, you're fired part. The do it right part, what I love about that is when you learn to do pricing right, it really means you understand your entire company well.
That's exactly right. And it's just wonderful when you don't hear from the salespeople. Not complain, or they may complain about the price levels.
Right.
Not complaining about the fact that I had to bend over and do strange and unnatural acts in front of my customer in order to get the deal.
Yes. Jim, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
They can use my personal email, Geisman @gmail.com.
Perfect. And to our listeners, I hope you guys enjoyed that just half as much as I did. I really enjoyed that. Last week, I asked you the question, what is value? And although it's too late to win the book, it's not too late to write your own answer on my LinkedIn page. We're about 3 weeks ahead in recording, so I'll announce the winner of the book as soon as I can. But this week, starting off the season of subscriptions, here's your new question. What is the most unique pricing model you've ever seen? Keep it pithy and interesting. I'll choose a winner who, again, is going to receive a copy of my first book, Impact Pricing, Your Blueprint for Driving Profits. And thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of the episode. If you got value out of this podcast, would you please tell your friends about it? Like us on however you subscribe to the podcast. It'll really help us out. Also, any suggestions or questions can always be sent to me directly, mark@impactpricing.com. And finally, please join us next week for the second episode in the season of subscriptions by Impact Pricing.